December 7th, 9.
Okay, in this lecture, we're going to talk about the U.S. actually getting involved in the war. So a little bit of context on this. In July of 1940, President Roosevelt began limiting what Japan could buy from the United States, and this was in response to their invasion of Manchuria. In September of 1940, he ended the sales of iron and steel, and then he hoped that this threat would limit further trade restrictions, and it would stop Japan's aggression into China. And in 1941, this is when Japan takes complete control of what is now known as modern day Vietnam. Then it was called Indochina. So in response, in 1941, Roosevelt froze all of the Japanese financial assets in the United States, and he cut off all oil shipments to Japan. The reason why this is important is because Japan is an island that relies on imported oil in order to function. So this oil embargo, as it was known, is really detrimental to Japan. So the United States and Japan will begin negotiations, but Roosevelt knows that there's little hope. In 1939, Americans had cracked the top secret Japanese code, like their diplomatic code, and the United States could read all of their intercepted diplomatic messages. And by November 27th, American military leaders knew that Japanese aircraft carriers were on the move in the Pacific, and they had expected a small-scale attack, but they didn't know where the attack would happen. And we all know by now that the attack would come at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. So the attack happens at 7 a.m. on December 7th, and an American Army radar operator noticed a large blip on his radar screen. He called his headquarters to report that planes were headed towards the island, and he was kind of told to not worry about it. And less than an hour later, more than 180 Japanese warplanes streaked overhead of Pearl Harbor. Half of the Pacific Fleet that was anchored in Pearl Harbor crowded in an area of less than 3 square miles. So almost all of their Pacific ships were squished into this very small area. And less than 2 hours later, 2,400 Americans were dead, 1,200 were wounded, 200 warplanes were damaged or destroyed, 18 warships are sunk or heavily damaged, and this includes 8 out of the 9 of the fleet's battleships. On that same day, Japan also attacked U.S. naval bases in Guam, the Philippines, and Wake Island. So in response, on December 9th, Roosevelt asks Congress to declare war. Every member but one voted for it, and even the members of the America First Committee called on its members to back the war effort at this point. On December 11th, Germany declared war on the U.S., and they did so in a very kind of racist way. They said they half Judaized and the other half negrified American nation was their war declaration. So basically saying like half of the U.S. are Jewish, the other half are Black, and so they kind of used a very racist statement, Germany did, in their war declaration on the United States. So now the United States will have to mobilize for war. America in the 1940s, the early 1940s, was really weak. The United States Army was ranked 19th in the world. It was behind Holland and Portugal. Roosevelt had been preparing for war, even though the American people were against entering a war in Europe. In September of 1940, Congress authorized the first peacetime draft in the nation's history. So again, this is before war is declared. This was called the Selective Training and Service Act. And it required all males ages 21 to 36 to register for military service. And then from there, a limited number of men was selected from that pool to serve per year in the Army. In addition to that, more than 16 million Americans served as soldiers, sailors, and aviators in the war. They called themselves GIs, and that's the abbreviation for government issue. With Native Americans, the Marines recruited more than 400 Navajos to serve as radio operators. And this was really crucial and really important because it provided the United States a secure way to communicate in several key battles of the war. These were called the Code Talkers, and they spoke in the native Navajo language. And this was a language that's very unique, and that even if the messages were intercepted, they had no way, European countries, especially Germany, had no way to understand the messages. And almost 1 million African Americans joined the military in World War II. At first, officials limited most Black troops to supporting roles and not combat roles. But by 1942, the military reluctantly gave African Americans the opportunity to fight. They fought in separate and segregated units. And one such unit was called the Tuskegee Airmen. And this was an all African American flying unit in the US military. And in 1944, since the United States faced heavy casualties, this forced the Army to accept Black Americans into white combat units, which led to desegregation of some squads. So the key here, and what's important, is that although the United States did so reluctantly, World War II was the first time that some units began to be integrated. Women were also used in almost every area except for combat. So many women, about 350,000, they would serve as clerks or secretaries, typists, air traffic controllers, mechanics, photographers, drivers, and of course, nurses. So in order to get America on board, they had to launch a really heavy propaganda campaign, once again, like they did in World War I. And the propaganda campaign was aimed at securing America's most basic freedoms. And the most famous propaganda campaign was illustrated by Norman Rockwell at this time. And he illustrated was called the Four Freedoms campaign. And the four freedoms are illustrated here. So there's the freedom of speech, the freedom from want, the freedom from fear, and the freedom of worship. Okay, so another thing that the United States does in order to mobilize or prepare for war is focus on the economy. So FDR knew that the federal government would have to coordinate production with American businesses. So he wanted to get American businesses involved with producing for the war. And so this would mean that the president would need to expand federal powers. And Roosevelt really believed that he could do this. And the reason why is that by this time, he had replaced many of the Supreme Court justices who tended to support the boosting of the federal government. So he had a lot of support, basically, for what he wanted to get done. In 1942, the government sets up the War Production Board. And the War Production Board is a group that will tell industries what they are going to produce and how much of it they're going to produce. And this was in order to direct the conversion of peacetime industries, so industries that operate in peacetime, to industries that produced war goods. It quickly halted the production of hundreds of civilian consumer goods, everything from cars to lawnmowers to bird cages, and it encouraged companies to make goods for the war. The armed forces decided which companies would receive contracts to manufacture war goods. So, for example, Ford during this time will start to make B-24 bombers. Henry Kaiser introduced the mass production to shipbuilding, and they were able to reduce the time it takes to build a ship from 200 days down to 40 days. And these were called Liberty ships. And each year of the war, the United States raised its production goal for military goods, and each year it met their goals. And by 1944, so towards the end of the war, the American production levels doubled those of all of the Axis nations put together. And by 1945, the United States had produced 300,000 airplanes, 100,000 tanks and armored cars, 5,600 merchant ships, 6 million rifles and machine guns, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. So when we talk about how the war, World War II, is what really fully recovers the United States from the Great Depression, this is why. So moving on to talking about the workforce during this time. So again, war production ended the massive unemployment of the Great Depression. And not only did people find jobs, but they earned more money for the work they were doing too. So average weekly wages in manufacturing increased more than 50% between 1940 and 1945. And with more people working, unions got stronger. From 1940 to 41, union membership increased by 1.5 million. And as far as strikes go, 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, unions agreed not to strike, and owners agreed not to use the lockouts. So as inflation rose during the war, unions resorted to strikes in order to make up for the losses. And in 1943, the United Mine Workers called for a strike, and it ended up in negotiation. So how they were going to pay for the war, just like in World War I, they are going to rely on war bonds. Roosevelt vowed during the war to spend whatever was necessary to sustain the war, or to help them win the war. So federal spending increased from $8.9 billion per year in 1935 to $95 billion in 1945, 10 times as much as what was spent in World War I. Higher taxes paid for about 41% of the war. So the government borrowed the rest of the money from banks or private investors and the public through war bonds. And the Treasury Department launched bond drives to encourage Americans to buy war bonds in order to help finance the war. And total war bond sales brought in about $186 billion. Okay, so here is a chart showing the unemployment and enlistment in the early 40s. 10 years of basically high unemployment came to an end as workers either joined the military or found jobs in defense industries. Okay, and on the home front, with so many people employed, many people for the first time had extra money in their pockets. And what are they going to buy? Really, the answer to that is nothing or not much. They were in the middle of a war. There were shortages and there was rationing and there was limited goods for people to purchase because so many different industries went to help the war. So, for example, the metal to make zippers or typewriters went instead into guns. Rubber that was used to make tires for army trucks instead of for bicycles. Nylon stockings, which were introduced in 1939, disappeared from store shelves because the nylon was needed for parachutes. And there was a new agency called the Office of Price Administration. And this is to combat the food supply falling short. The government needed the food for the military, and the government worried that a short food supply would mean really high inflation, so really high increase on prices. So the Office of Price Administration oversaw rationing during the war. It would assign point values to items like sugar, coffee, meat, butter, canned fruit, shoes, and then it would give people ration books or books of coupons worth a certain number of points for food and clothing. And once your coupons were all used up, you were done until the next month or until you traded with somebody. There was also the Office of War Information. And the Office of War Information worked with magazine publishers, advertising agencies, and radio stations. They hired writers and artists to create posters and ads that stirred American patriotic feelings. And one popular idea, again, this was used in World War I, were victory gardens, which was a vegetable garden planted to add home food to the home front. And that way that farm surpluses could go to support the soldiers. So soon people in cities and suburbs were planting all sorts of things in their backyards, tomatoes and peas and radishes. They were using empty parking lots and playgrounds to put gardens in. And by 1943, victory gardens produced about 1/3 of the country's fresh vegetables.